Now let me go ahead and introduce AJ to you. AJ Adkins, and I'm going to yammer on for a little bit so you can take a screenshot or write down his contact information. AJ has been doing planter modifications for farmers for, gosh, since at least 2010, and started NTM Ag Equipment back in 2013, specifically to do planter modifications. For the last 6 years, he's also been working with Thon Equipment, and he's got a pretty active Twitter feed, and it's a good one. If you follow Twitter, has some really good videos on it. Suggest you check that out. Rather than yammer on a whole lot more, let's go ahead and throw it live to AJ inside a shop outside of Indianapolis. AJ.
Hi, yeah, good morning, everybody. I want to thank Lisa, her team, for the virtual shop visit. Hopefully this one goes smooth. I know everybody's getting tired of the virtual meetings, but hey, at least we don't have to get out where it's cold and snowy. Everybody can stay in for the most part. So yeah, again, I want to thank Lisa and everybody for putting this together, and also for Paul Yassa's video, Phil Needham's video. Were both done very well. If you've not watched those yet, I highly advise you watch those and put much more emphasis on their wisdom and knowledge versus mine, but I'm happy to be here nonetheless, and hopefully we can all learn something out of this. So as Lisa mentioned, I work for Thon Equipment. I have my own business setting up planters. I also work for Starkey Farms in Brownsburg. It's more of a part-time, do planter setups, planter modifications for planting into cover crops, no-till, conventional till, different setups like that. And that's kind of where we got our start. And that's what NTM means. NTM actually stands for a need to meet. At the time when we started the company, there weren't a lot of companies that were set up for getting planters to work into a green cover crop. Fortunately, and I guess unfortunately, we'd already had many challenges, made many mistakes planting into cover crops. So we learned from that, learned kind of what worked on our farm, on the farm here, what didn't work, and what's going to work best. And basically just kind of took all that knowledge and put it out for whoever could use it. And so that's kind of how we got started. So we'll kind of talk about the planter that we're looking at here. Jessica, if you want to go ahead and show those three pictures that we have for the introduction. We had pictures of the planter set up for running into a standing cover crop. There we are. So that was a couple years ago. That's the planter we're looking at today, going into a stand of actually a very mature stand of annual ryegrass that gets taller than it normally does. Show the next slide. So going into a setup like this, and then trying to make it work with the planter setup as is something that we've been playing with for, I guess over 10 years, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not on purpose. Show the next slide. And that's what it looks like. This was actually last year near the home farm here in Brownsburg, Indiana. The same planter we're looking at today set up the exact same way, going into a stand of, this was a pretty mature, thick stand of hairy vetch. It gets thicker, but we actually had pretty good success with going into this, a lot better than I thought we would have, set up with the row cleaners that we have, and that actually is using full down pressure on the row cleaners, the gauge wheels, and then the closing wheels. So, okay, let's go back live. So today we're going to start at basically the front of a planter, the row unit, work our way back, because that's what everybody does. So that's what we're going to do today. So I'm going to start today with discussing the no-till coulter. Paul Yassa also mentioned some stuff about this, so I advise looking at his presentation, as I mentioned. No-till coulters, I'm not typically a huge fan of a no-till coulter. You notice this planter does not have one. We pulled the no-till coulters off the planter many years ago. Reason being, a lot of times the no-till coulter can actually do more harm than good. It can go too deep. Is often a problem. It goes too deep, it gives us a false seed bottom because it goes deeper than what the disc openers are set at. Even when the no-till coulter is set up so that it's higher than disc openers, when the planter is going through the field, we've actually watched where that row unit will want to dip, the planter will go into a swath or somewhere and it'll want to dip, and it'll shove that no-till coulter down deeper than the disc openers and then give me a false seed bottom. So I'm going to have issues getting the seed to the bottom of that trench. The time where I do like having a no-till coulter is going to be in a high residue environment behind stripper wheat or if we're going into a stand of serial ride that's fallen down, or if we rolled it, something that's going to be able to cut through that. And if we're going to do that, I like a very narrow Coulter. I have today, this is actually a Coulter off of a strip till unit. Same idea. I prefer the Ripple Coulter, a very narrow Coulter. All it's going to do is slice through that residue, slice through that soil, so the disc openers behind it running deeper can actually get in there. This is a 18-inch. Planter setup would be a 16-inch, but same idea. I do not like the bigger, the 13-wave Coulters. Jessica, show that picture. I think I have a picture of a 13-wave that's on there. The 13-wave, the 8-wave Coulters that are on there. Yeah, so there's a 13-wave Coulter. That's an aggressive Coulter. It's a wider Coulter. Running something like that, it's going to have to be very sharp, and it's not going to do a great job at cutting the residue and then allowing us to get through. All right, let's go back live. So running a wide Coulter like that has been done in the past, and I still work with a lot of guys who are having issues with, especially these bigger planters. We get into the 16, 24 row, the Bauer planters that get into the DB90, DB120, the rows that don't want to get depth. So the mindset has always been, if I can't get the row unit in the ground because I probably don't have enough weight there, the disc openers aren't getting the same depth. So the mindset has been, let's put a big wavy no-till Coulter on the front of it to disturb the soil so the disc opener can then fall in. Typically what we see when we do that is, if I'm not getting depth with two disc openers trying to get in there, putting a wide no-till Coulter on the front is going to actually keep the row unit out of the ground versus breaking up the compaction or whatever we've got there and letting the disc opener go in. So I'm actually doing more harm than good in a situation like that. That wider no-till Coulter, because that comes into a 13 wave is right at 3/4 of an inch, an 8 wave is a little wider than that, just under an inch. So you're basically taking all that steel and trying to just shove it directly into the ground. And a lot of times there's just not enough down pressure on the row unit for you to do that. So it's going to keep the row unit out of the ground. So a lot of times what we see is, if I take off that no-till Coulter, the disc openers actually do a pretty good job at pushing themselves in the ground, and actually makes it a lot easier. And then when we get into a wetter soil, that no-till Coulter can also bring up some ribboning, some mud, and I think Paul mentioned that. We can bring up that mud behind it and throw it into the disc openers and the gauge wheels. So there are times I like it in a high residue situation where we just have to cut to the bottom of that trench. It's going to work well. And again, we don't want it to the bottom of the trench, but I want it just above the disc openers. Let the disc openers create the seed bottom. But it's also going to, the idea is limit the amount of hairpinning so the disc openers aren't catching that residue, pulling it to the bottom of the trench. Okay, so that's no-till Coulters. And there's times where it works. There's times where, sometimes, I'm not saying today that everything I'm mentioning you have to do. There are times where the no-till Coulter works, but what I usually suggest, if somebody's fighting me that they have to have it, they've always had it, take off half the planter, take off, on a 12 row, rows 1 through 6, take off the no-till Coulter and see how it does. See how it pulls, see how the units get in the ground, see how your emergence looks, and just try it. A lot of times, majority of the guys end up taking it off, but there are times where it is necessary. All right, let's move on to trash wheels. So we'll move from the no-till Coulter back to the trash wheel setup. We'll spend some time here. This is always a popular one. Trash wheels, there's a lot of different options. It really comes down to a fixed trash wheel versus a floating trash wheel. And you'd probably be surprised, I actually prefer a fixed trash wheel, sometimes more than a floating trash wheel. The mindset's always been that if I've got a fixed, the next step is a floating. Floating's always going to be better. There are times that I do like a fixed trash wheel bolted to the front of the unit versus a floating one that's hanging out front. So we've got a couple of different options. The fixed one, we can look at the bean planter I've got set up next to the corn planter over here. This is our 30-inch, the corn planter. A fixed row cleaner is going to bolt to the 4 bolts on the front faceplate, and it's going to be fixed to the row unit. It's going to have the adjustability and either a screw adjust on the top, or it's going to be where you pull it up and stick a pin, but you're manually setting that depth of that row cleaner, but it's going to be a fixed setup. So setting up a fixed row cleaner when we're in the field, I'm going to set the planer down, let the row unit suck itself in. I'm going to screw or adjust the row cleaners all the way down to where they touch the soil and it's tight, and I'm going to come up about a turn. I don't want that fixed row cleaner spinning 100% of the time. And a lot of times that's the issue, is a guy spends a lot of money on a nice new, fixed row cleaner setup. And when he's planning, he wants to turn around and see every one of those trash wheels turning. That's an issue, because typically if I'm turning 100% of the time, I'm going to be gouging. Really, all I want that row cleaner to do is move the residue off the top of the soil. Really, if there's any crusting, maybe just kind of break that crust up a little bit, but not get really into any of the soil at all. And if a fixed row cleaner is spinning 100% of the time, it's getting into that soil and it's moving that soil off the top, and the disc openers are having to get in deeper with that. So if we're doing a fixed row cleaner all the way down, up a turn, and I want that spinning, 60, 80% of the time, I'm happy with that. A floating row cleaner. So a couple options on a floating row cleaner. A standard, a typical one is going to bolt to the front of the unit. It's going to hang out front, and the row unit's going to push it through the field. I have an issue with that, and that's times where I like the fixed row cleaner bolted to the unit versus the one I'm pushing through the field. The problem with pushing the row cleaner when it's hanging out front is it wants to get in and it wants to get too aggressive. It's going through the field and the soil's catching it, wanting to pull it down into the ground. So we stick, bigger, wider treader wheels or depth bands to keep it from doing that. We'll put an air cylinder in there to actually try to pick the row unit up. My issue with that is also when we're pushing through the field, it's fighting the row unit. I always use the analogy, if you're pushing the wheelbarrow through a pasture and something catches that front tire, what's it do to the handlebars? It picks up the handlebars. It's doing the same thing to my row unit. We've got to watch that when we're going through the field. If I'm putting down pressure down, I really need to be careful that I'm not putting too much down pressure to where it catches and it's going to want to try to pick up the row unit. I'm going to have a system that is sensing that, some kind of down pressure system. And typically what we've seen is that when it picks up that row unit, it senses the drop on gauge wheel pressure, and it puts more down pressure on the row unit if it's an active system. And the problem then is I'm pushing this down, pushing the row cleaner down in, and it's a constant battle. The row cleaner now has more pressure, it's pushing the row unit back up, and they're constantly fighting each other. So a floating row cleaner, bolted unit that I'm pushing, I'm not a huge fan of. There are times where it works really well on very hilly terrain, and it would work better than the fixed row cleaner, but I'm always a little cautious of it. Guys have that mindset that, if they've got the fix, the next step is the floating, and that's going to be so much better. And that's not always the case, especially in a conventional till ground, or if you're into a strip till ground or something like that, that floating row cleaner is going to really want to get too aggressive. The floating row cleaner I do like. This is a Dawn GFX. We've ran these for, I believe, 8-9 years now. This is a floating row cleaner, so I've got that adjustability. It floats up and down. The big difference is, and the reason I like it, is it bolts to the frame. It is not bolted to the row unit. It's actually got brackets that bolt up to the frame, and I'm pulling behind. I'm actually pulling it to the ground versus pushing. So it's naturally, the soil is pushing it up out of the ground, so it's coming up. So I like that. It just works. The physics of it just seem to work a lot better. This setup, I'm actually giving a little bit of hydraulic pressure to keep it right there in the cab where I want it. So that's a nice system. It worked really well on the hairy vetch that we were in last year. And because it tucks up next to the unit, it's not throwing excessive residue out to the row next to it. It's a nice clean system. But as I said, my biggest reason for this is that I can sit here and I can do this in the field. I can do this all day, and it's not going to affect the row unit. Jessica, show the video that I have. I took a video 4, 5, 6 years ago of one of our planter setups with the GFX on there. So this is no-till. We've got some corn stalks there, but it might be kind of hard to see. You can see I can increase the pressure there on it, but the big thing with this video is showing is that the row cleaners are completely independent of the row unit. So when I'm going through the field, if I hit a rock, if I hit something, it's bouncing around, but it does nothing to disturb my row unit. So I'm not fighting it. The row cleaner is not trying to push the row unit out of the ground. They're completely independent. So when we're looking at some of these new planters, the high-speed planters that guys are dealing with, the only planters we've really been able to get to that decent ride quality have been planters that have the row cleaner off of the row unit. Okay, Jessica. So the Dawn equipment GFX row cleaner has been out for, I think since 2007, 2008 was our first one, bolted to the frame. As you can see, there's another company that I've got the picture of, Precision Planting, has released their groundbreaking, latest and greatest row cleaner. And as you can see, it actually bolts to the toolbar. All right, let's cut out of that, Jessica. So it's a revolutionary system that works really well. Bolts to the toolbar, something that, you know, nobody's ever done like this. But that being said, it's a similar design to this. It bolts to the frame. I like that. That's, as I said, I really like that with the row cleaner. It bolts to the frame, not the row unit. The reveal, I don't know much about it. I believe it's using a treader wheel. It's got a gauge wheel in the center, and that's actually what's setting the depth. But similar idea. They're using that firming wheel to firm up in front of the disc openers, but it's a pull type system bolted to the frame. And as I keep mentioning over and over, getting the row cleaner on the frame of the planter, not the row unit, making these independent, I really like that. I really like that setup. It works very well, especially getting the ride quality. The whole reason I'm putting a trash wheel on there is to get a good ride quality, so my singulation on the meter is dead on. When I put a row cleaner on there and it's bouncing around and getting chatter and it's pushing it up into the row unit, it's affecting my singulation when I'm going through the field. Okay, next we'll talk about some gauge wheels. Gauge wheel setups, Paul talked about this, and I think Phil Needham also mentioned talking about these. These are the setup, standard John Deere setup. This is a 4.5-inch wide. I do like the narrow gauge wheel that Paul talked about. I like that in a conventional till setup. It's going to work. I like that on the strip till. I like a lot because when you're making a strip, you know, it's only so wide. So running a narrower gauge wheel, it's going to be on that strip. It's not fighting the no-till ground next to it. It's going to be able to set that depth. No-till, I like the narrow gauge wheel set up on there. We've got narrow gauge wheels on the bean planter next to us. I believe they are Needham's narrow gauge wheel. It's a 2 3/4 inch wide gauge wheel. So the row unit's not trying to fight setting depth with a wider gauge wheel. We do have an active down pressure system on there. So that's able to get the depth set. I'm not fighting compaction as much as I used to in the past. And then I think I've got a video. Jessica, is there a video or a picture maybe that's on there that we can show of the gauge wheels? Not sure which one it is, if there is one. If there's not. Oh, okay. Yeah, so the gauge wheel, and Paul talked about this. This is the Mudsmith wheel. Go ahead and go to the next one. This is the Mudsmith. They sell the spoked wheel and the narrow. Yeah, so Paul mentioned these type of gauge wheels. It's got that 3-spoke system. I like that, you know, where you're going to be talking into, all right, let's go live. So the 3-spoke, basically we get rid of that plastic and we've got the visibility. I can see the disc openers on there. I can see what they look like. You know, when they pop the rivets off and it's rolling around, it's easy to see that. It's designed for when we're planting into mud. None of us plant into mud. We don't plant into mud. Obviously here, this isn't dirty. You guys probably plant into mud, but we don't. So that's a joke, sorry. So the 3-spoke setup, I like. The idea is that it's supposed to, when you get mud buildup in there, it's going to let it come out, and it's going to be easier to service. So I like that 3-spoke setup. There's a few other companies that are offering it. I think it's a good setup. If we're going to look at replacing it, I don't have an issue with that. So moving on from gauge wheels we'll look at disc openers. As you can see, these are the serrated disc openers on this planter. We've ran these for 2 years now. Paul talked about these. I agree with Paul. He had talked about, he had some concerns with them. And I think after looking at last spring, I like the way that it cuts through. These are put on there. We've got a serrated edge on both sides. So I've got a picture of it, or actually a new one. So it's got a serrated edge built into it. My concern with this is the wear component. How long is this going to wear? These are going to wear faster than a standard set of disc openers. It's going to happen. You're going to wear that edge off. These ones have 2 years on them, and they are pretty well worn down. I do like they do a pretty good job at cutting into that residue. So if you're going to be planting green, I like that. It cuts the residue. I'm concerned about what Paul talked about when it's wet out. I think especially in Brownsburg here in central Indiana, we've got a pretty tight, heavy clay. The disc openers getting into a tight, heavier, wet clay. I'm concerned about the sidewall smearing. I think it's doing a little bit of tillage, and it is maybe smearing that white sidewall just a little bit. So that's something we need to be cautious on. The theory, I think, works well. It does seem to cut the slot better, and it seems to cut through even that vetch that we were in last year. It does a good job at cutting through that vetch without hairpinning as much, but they've got to be new. I'm not against just running disc openers, standard OEM disc openers. I want them sharp. So, you know, replacing every year. If you're not going to do anything on the planter and you're going into a no-till, a green stand, you don't have trash wheels or gauge wheels or whatever, at least put a new set of disc openers on that can cut through that residue. That's going to give you your best setup. So yeah, that's briefly, discussing disc openers. And as I mentioned, Paul talked about the disc openers as well, talked about the serrated ones, where they work, where they don't work. So as I keep mentioning, they're smarter than I am. So look at Paul and Phil's videos as well. All right, so moving on, we'll look at row unit down pressure. This planer is set up with the factory John Deere hydraulic down pressure. This is a high-speed planer. We've actually done testing with it. We've ran anywhere from 6 all the way up to, I think we've done 10 and a half with it. Singulation with these planers with the factory John Deere ExactEmerge system, dead on. No matter if I go 6 miles an hour and by the end of the row speed it up to 10 miles an hour, singulation is dead on. That is doing really well. I like that. But as Paul's mentioned, as I think Phil had mentioned as well, singulation's great, but what's driving my yield is uniform emergence. Uniform emergence comes from uniform depth. So if I'm going faster, I'm going to actually need a lot more down pressure to get the row unit to stay in the ground, to get in the ground. That's where, that's what's setting yield, is not necessarily singulation as much as we thought in the past. I do like the singulation system, but we're not going to talk too much about the metering today. This setup is an automated down pressure system. This is an individual row. In past videos, I've talked about individual row versus sectional. I think I was wrong then. I'll be safe to admit that. I think an individual row system is better, and I think it's going to pay for itself versus a sectional system. A sectional system would be, say this row has a load sensor on it that's sensing the down pressure. It's actually sensing the gauge wheel load. So when you get into a compacted area in the disc opener, the row itself wants to come out of the ground, it senses that the gauge wheel load gets lighter, and it will actively put more down pressure on this system. If we do a sectional system, this row unit would be controlling this row, but also typically, at least the rows on either side of it.
AJ, I'd like to butt in just for a quick question.
Yeah.
Any suggestions for areas with really low precipitation, 6 to 9 inches, say? Soils get really hard and it's near impossible to no-till into wheat residue.
Down pressure on the planer toolbar itself, not necessarily row unit down pressure, but weight, static weight on the toolbar is critical, especially any kind of no-till, even around here where there is moisture. Getting suitcase weights on the outside wings, even if you've got markers, getting suitcase weights on the outside wings. A lot of companies are coming out with a hydraulic weight transfer that's going to take the weight from, like this planer's got a CCS system. It's got all the seed and the fertilizer in the center of the frame. A system where it's automating or it's transferring that weight from the center of the frame to the outside wings would be critical. And somewhere like that, I would not run I probably would not run a no-till Coulter in a setup like that. It's just, at least around here, what I've seen is that no-till Coulter is constantly fighting that row unit, trying to get it in the ground. So a good set of disc openers and weight on the toolbar, because these row units can get that depth, but they've got to be able to get weight. They're getting their leverage off that toolbar. And a lot of times what you'll see, even on a 12, 16 row, those outside wings are trying to get to that depth, but they're picking up, they can't get leverage off that toolbar because they're picking up the frame. You'll actually see that frame floating above the ground. So either a weight transfer system that can adjust on the go or just pushes the center weight from the center of the frame to the outside wings is very nice, or just make some kind of homemade bracket and stick suitcase weights. I mean, heck, I've seen guys stick totes out on the end just with liquid that are just there for weight to keep that bar consistent from row 1 to row 12, row 1 to row 36, whatever it is. Make sure that entire frame is level through the entire planer. That would be the first thing that I would do. And then from there, probably look at disc openers. Yeah, I don't know if I have a good question or answer for that, but the down pressure system, going back to that, I like the active system. I like the individual row control. The John Deere systems actually work really well for us. There's a lot of systems on the market. Precision Planning has the Delta Force that is down pressure and uplift. Dawn Equipment actually builds these for John Deere and supplies them to John Deere for their new planters. So we build these in-house. We also have an aftermarket system, the Reflex, which is down pressure and uplift. I like, we use that on our strip till. I think it's mandatory to have the uplift on strip till. On a row unit, I don't have as much weight, especially a row unit like this with the individual or with the CCS system where I'm not storing a lot of weight on the row unit. If I've got a 3 bushel box or, you know, the bushel and a half or whatever box on here where I'm storing a lot of weight from the seed, that's where maybe uplift would be beneficial on certain soils. Around here, no-till, heavy clay, even the conventional till, we never really saw a need to have the uplift. A lot of times we set the row unit deeper. Now I'm going to err on the side. I'm going to err on too much down pressure. I'm not as concerned about too much down pressure, too much weight from the row unit itself. Sometimes what we'll do is run heavy duty down pressure springs and flip them so they're actually picking the row unit up. If I'm running a 3 bushel box, that's something that I could do if I'm going into a conventional till. If I've maybe got a sandier soil, I can do that where that spring is always trying to pick the row unit up, but I've got a down pressure system that's actually putting more down pressure down. So the hydraulic system, I really like it. The individual row control works really well, especially with the all the different soil types that we have going from one soil type to the next. It's always the same. So I do like that. But there are other options, the pneumatic system, and then the heavy duty down pressure spring. And Paul actually mentioned, I actually prefer and I've actually seen a heavy duty down pressure spring system outperform a airbag system. So the problem we get into with an airbag system is when we come out with an active pneumatic system. So it's set up the same way as my hydraulic setup here. It's got the sensors on the gauge wheel and it's reading when the row unit gets light and it's trying to put more pressure down. It's constantly adjusting to the field. The problem with the pneumatic is it's not fast enough. I can, dump the air just like that and really lighten the unit up, but waiting for that air pressure to build back up to put the unit back in the ground, a lot of times when you're going, even 4.5, 5 miles an hour, a lot of times I don't have enough pressure on the row unit to get it back into the ground where I want it. And I've got I'm changing through the field, and there's no uniformity, is what Paul was talking about in his video as well. The heavy duty down pressure spring, a constant heavy duty. There's gonna be times where it's too much down pressure, but as I said, I'm gonna err on that side versus not enough down pressure. When we dump the air, because you get into a sandy or on top of a knob, or it gets really sandy and it gets too heavy, when you come off that and go into that really compacted area and there's not enough pressure there, and the row unit comes up out of the ground and we start losing seed depth, that's what I want to avoid. That's very critical. I want that uniform seed depth through the field, and the only way to get that is with a heavy duty down pressure system. So I'm going to err. I'm not overly concerned if I'm creating a little bit of compaction. I'll use something like the closing wheel to kind of maybe break that up a little bit, but I want to be able to get that seed to the depth that all the row units are set at. That's very critical. And then I think there's a picture of a standard, just an OEM John Deere. Yeah, so that's a factory John Deere OEM bag, just an air bag. I like these setups. It's when we put a sensor on there and when we make it an active system. It'll still work well, but I just have to make sure that it's not adjusting too much. We can, most systems, you can set your preferences, your settings so that it's not constantly adjusting. It's not constantly hunting for the right number, that it stays somewhat constant. You can run the heavier setting, which I tend to do on most of the setups, okay? So we'll move on from the row unit down pressure system to the closing wheels. This is always a fun one. This is always one that if you're going to do some kind of attachment on the planter, closing wheels always seem to be the first one, or the easiest. They're right there on the back. They're easy to get to. And as I mentioned on the row unit down pressure, running too much down pressure, maybe creating a little bit of compaction, I like to use a wheel that's going to be able to break up some of that compaction. So this planter is set up with, this is just a Dawn gauge tine wheel. We've ran, I can't tell you how many different combinations, how many different wheels we've ran on all the planters. It seems like every year I figure out, this is the wheel, this is the one I want, this is the one everybody should have. The next year we plant and that was not the wheel we wanted, definitely not the setup. It just seems like it's constantly changing, and there's always different options, and so I like that setup. Before I get there, the trash wheels, I forgot to mention the different types of wheels themselves. You can see on this one, I've got a Dawn scissor wheel is what that's called. It's very similar to like the other shark tooth wheel, so that it cuts into and it pulls the stuff out of the way. This setup is a standard setup I like on that Dawn has. It's a 12 3/4 inch, just under 13 inches. It's a tooth wheel. like similar to the Martin. The difference is this wheel is actually swept back. It's not a straight spike. So I like that swept back design. So when I'm going through cover crops, when I'm going through something like that, it's going to want to wrap or hairy vetch, even around here, hairy vetch. And then we've got some other low creeping weeds that'll get caught up in there. In that, just enough that swept back tooth, and we've got some little strippers that go on there and kind of help pull that stuff off. So I like a swept back tooth that's not a straight spike. The straight spike can pitchfork sometimes that stuff, and it wants to wrap up. Then once it starts building up, it just kind of turns into a mess. I have noticed the wheels that run the guys that are running the depth bands, either on this setup or like even if you're pushing, the depth bands help kind of keep that cleaned out. And it's just because it's not letting that stuff get down to the bottom of the tooth in there. So that's been a good setup. So yeah, that was, sorry, I missed that, but that was a brief on trash wheels. I'm going to spin the camera and make everybody nice and sick, so I apologize for that. We are going to look at, I've got a few different setups here when we're looking at closing wheels. So the studies that we've done, I say studies, but I mean, basically, we put on a few different, actually, Jessica, show that first picture. I think it's a setup of a standard planner that we work with. Guys, this is a 24 row, yeah, and this is a common, as I mentioned, I can advise you to put every different type of trash or closing wheel on your planner, but until you get it into your soil on your planner and your system, that's really the only way to know what's going to work best for you. This is a 24 row planner. The first row you can see I've got on, the Dawn gauge tine. The next one is a rubber, OEM rubber with a spike wheel. Next to that, some other combination. We've got a curved tine, and then they run just a standard rubber tire on there. Go to the next slide. So, but that's what I suggest. Get a couple to try out. Get 2-3 different brands before, it's a lot of money just to have a couple, just to try. But if I tell you to go put on, this closing wheel, you buy 48 of them to put on a planner, and it just is a disaster, did not work for your soil type, you're going to be a lot more angry with me than if I just told you to put on 2 different closing wheels. So I like doing that. I like doing on row 1 and then the end row, row 16, 24, whatever it is. So when you go down and come back, you've got a little 2-row check right there to see what that row looks like versus the row next to it. So there's a lot of different combinations of closing wheels, even running them different setups. We've got, this is a picture, I believe it's out of the Bex PFR. It's an OEM, just a rubber tire there, then a curved tine. Then we've got the spike, and then we've got a standard Martin spike wheel, the Pro Stitch, the Copperhead Ag. All right, show the next slide. That's a Copperhead Ag. That's a Furrow Cruiser, the Extreme. Show the next slide. So this is our planner going into, this is a little bit of a clover, some green cover crop that had just been sprayed. The curved tine wheels set up on there do a pretty good job at breaking up that sidewall, getting the slot closed. Next slide. This is a close-up of that curved tine wheel on our planner. You can see we've made the slot there in the center with the disc openers. The gauge wheels have kind of firmed up behind that, and then those curved tine wheels are centered, and they're breaking up, chipping in that sidewall as they go through there. All right, next slide. This is a new one. This is a Dawn wheel, actually just released Friday or yesterday, I think. Show the next one. So it's a gauge tine wheel like what I have on the planner here, except it goes into the factory OEM plastic, similar to how the Furrow Cruiser is, but this is a cast setup that goes in there instead of the poly plastic, so it's going to have a little more weight to it. All right, show the next one. Okay, one more, maybe. Yeah. Okay, I think that's it on closing wheels. So that's the, I believe the model number 1304. Let's go back live. All right, so all those different combinations, all those wheels that everybody's selling, I have to say on the farm here, on the heavier, tighter clay, the best wheel at closing the slot is a OEM cast wheel. This one's actually a Dawn. It's designed for the M Series hub, but it's copied. It kind of looks just like the factory OEM wheel that a lot of guys have had in the past. On a heavier soil, I like to run a heavier wheel. I like to rely on the weight of the closing wheel itself to close the slot versus running a heavier down pressure on the T-handle. I think it does a better job. A lot of guys don't know or haven't realized or don't pay attention that T-handle, every time we move down one slot, we're taking roughly 20 to 25 pounds away from the row unit. So if you don't have an active pneumatic system, when you go back there and you start out the year and you've got it in the first slot and you're planning, and by the end, or you get some rain or it gets heavier, again, no-till, and you go down to that fourth notch with a standard OEM tailpiece spring that's on there, when you do that, you're robbing that row unit of, you know, over 50 pounds more than likely. So because it's getting its leverage off the row unit. So the more down pressure it's trying to do, it's trying to pick up the row unit, just like the row unit's using the weight of that frame of the planter. So just be conscious of that, that when you, every time you move that handle down, go down to that fourth notch, it's trying to get its leverage, and it's actually going to be putting more down pressure down like you wanted, but it's getting it from the row unit. So it might be trying to pick up, and it's going to start messing with your row unit. So if you're running heavy duty down pressure springs, if you're running just a static airbag, be conscious of that. It's trying to pick up that row, the row unit itself now. We don't want to risk losing our seat depth because we're doing that. So just be aware of that. If you need to put more down pressure, if you can adjust the springs when you do that, just something to check.
AJ,
yeah.
I'd like to break in with a couple, or at least one more question, maybe two.
Yeah.
Would a Furrow cruiser be able to break up the sidewall if there's a slight compaction in no-till?
Yes, yeah, I like the Furrow cruisers. The Furrow cruiser, the plastic one, I like. It does a really good job. It's a light wheel, weight-wise, and that's where I have a little bit of a concern. You're going to have to run a little more down pressure on the tailpiece to get that, to get into the ground and break that up. So I actually prefer, I like the Furrow Cruiser Extreme, the cast setup. It's a little heavier. The new one that we have, that Dawn has, which is basically, it's a gauge tine. So it's basically a setup like this, a gauge tine. It's got these teeth, but it's just this band that goes in that polyplastic wheel. So it's a lower cost setup, but it's a cast band. So it's not going to have the weight of running two gauge tines that are going to get in there, but it's going to have a little more weight than that polyplastic on the Furrow Cruiser. But I like the Furrow Cruiser. I think it's a good setup. It's just the weight is my only concern. It's not as heavy, so you have to rely more on the tailpiece, the row unit down pressure to get that to get in there. But I like what it does. I like those notches. The straight spike wheel we've struggled with in the past with cover crops. We've had issues where it wants to wrap up a little bit. Actually, I think, Jessica, can you show the two videos that we have on there? I've got a video of the Schlagel wheel and then also a video of the Martin spike wheel that's on there. That's off of our planters. So the first one, this is a Martin spike wheel that I have, and we've taken a video with a GoPro, and I did this years ago, and I thought I was good at video editing, which turns out I'm not. But this is a Martin spike wheel, and it's actually taking that slot and it's trying to close it. I can't get enough leverage in our heavier, you know, the clay soils where it's going to pick up, but that wheel is designed to break up compaction. That's what that's there to do. It's not going to give me any kind of firming around the seat slot. It's designed to break up the compaction, get in there, and then kind of lift and fracture. It's just a straight spike. Show the next one. The next one will be a Schlagel Posi-close. I was really excited about this. We tried it 4 or 5 years ago, and we've tried it a couple years since. So it's kind of an idea. It's going to break up, it's going to firm, it's going to break up a little bit of that compaction with the staggered bar setup. But you can see really struggled. There's a way to set these more aggressive, and I did it one season. I didn't get video of it, but I just could not get that slot to close up. This isn't a no-till. This is a heavy clay soil, and it's, you know, a little wet. Like I said, I don't play in mud, but, you know, this one might be a little muddy. So that setup, all right, let's go back live. So
AJ, how about are you going to speak at all about closing wheel for conventional till systems?
Yes. Yep. Okay. Yep. I'll get there.
Great. Thank you.
So this is a Schlagel, the same setup that we were talking, that we actually saw the video of. I like it. There's areas where it works, and it just has not worked well in the heavy clay that we have. I just could not get enough action from it to get that slot closed the way I wanted. As I mentioned earlier, the best wheel almost every year at getting that slot closed is a cast wheel. It's a great job. Cast wheel smashes it shut. My problem is I go back there right behind the planter. That row is shut. I'm using down pressure on the tailpiece. I've got the slot closed. It looks great. Sun comes out, it dries up a little bit. That slot just goes bonk, pops right back open. and I'm not getting enough. I'm not getting any kind of interaction. So even when I run that cast wheel next to a factory, just a factory plastic wheel, the cast does a better job at getting the slot closed in the heavier soil. So that's kind of my rule of thumb. The heavier the soil, the heavier the wheel that I want to run with it, so I don't have to rely on that tailpiece as I mentioned earlier. The plastic one, same idea as a cast, same overall diameter, just doesn't have the weight though, doesn't have the mass to get that slot closed. And it's the same thing. If I get the slot closed with this, smash it shut, it dries up a little bit and that slot just pops right back open. So I like the heavy wheel, but I like some kind of incorporation with it. This is a curved tine wheel. This is kind of the idea of a cast, a rubber. It's going to be firming, but it's also taking a little bit of that Martin, that spike wheel, breaking up that compaction. So that spike wheel is hitting that sidewall and it's breaking up the compaction, but it doesn't give me any of that firming around that. The curved tine is kind of the best of both worlds. It's going to give me the firming, like with that thumbprint that's on there. So it's coming in around, and that thumbprint is going to firm around that seed. But then at the same time, it's a staggered tooth. So it's sitting there chipping in that sidewall as I go, kind of breaking up that compaction. So it does a good job. I've struggled the last couple of years in the heavy no-till where it's a little moist. Again, not mud. I don't do that. But when we get into something like that, the staggered tooth, I lose contact. And I've noticed where we had one year, we were really struggling getting the slot closed with this setup. The bean planter was parked, and I went and robbed the bean planter a couple rows of the gauge tine wheel off the bean planter to try on the corn planter. Same idea. It's the same overall diameter as the curved tine wheel. It's got that tooth, but it has a solid band. So this one is actually designed to be kind of like a depth band. If we're running soybeans, cotton, a shallower seed where I don't want to have to worry about the teeth getting in and getting too aggressive and too deep, we run a setup like this. And for our heavier clay no-till soils, this has been a really good universal wheel. I don't lose contact with the soil. I'm always touching, smashing the row like a cast wheel is going to do, but I've also got that tooth in there that's going to break up that compaction. So it's going to do a really good job at doing both. So this is the wheel we've actually ran pretty consistently on almost all the rows. I always have row 1 and usually row 2 set up with a couple different combinations, a new wheel that the latest and greatest that you have to have, or you don't know how to farm, basically. We put that on there and see what happens. Yeah, Joe.
We've got a question here, and you showed it a little bit with some of your testing. What do you think about mixing up wheels? Right. So, yep. I mean, there's no end to the amount of combinations you can do. Correct. But what are your thoughts about, say, a rubber or a cast on one side, and then something else with a spike or curved tine or something to get a little more aggressive?
Yeah, I like that a lot. It's cheaper, a lot cheaper to do that too. So I definitely understand why you want to do that. And we will do that. Typically when I would do that, I would run an aggressive wheel like the curved tine, maybe like the Furrow Cruiser Extreme, something where I can get some weight, and then run a rubber tire next to it. So what we'll do on the tailpiece, I'll actually run the more aggressive wheel, the spike wheel that's designed to break up some of that compaction, but also firm a little around that. Run it in the front hole. Most of the planters we work with, the Deere, the Kinsey planters, Case, you're on your own, I guess. With that type of setup, you've got on the tailpiece, you've got 2 holes, a front hole and a back hole. I prefer the spike, the more aggressive wheel in the front hole. We'll put the rubber tire or the cast. I typically, there are times where I like it. Most guys are going to run just a factory rubber tire. Put it in the back hole. So that's going to keep that tailpiece floating. It's going to keep the spike wheel or whatever we got in the front from getting too deep. So I like that combination. When we look at, the combination of, a spike wheel and the factory rubber one, we've actually played with running the curved tine, and, I'll put the gauge tine in the back hole, the curved tine in the front, because the gauge tine is going to keep that tailpiece out of the ground and the curved tine can get more aggressive. I'm really not too concerned on corn of it getting flipped out of the trench. We do have to be careful with a straight spike wheel. They can get too aggressive. It can get too aggressive. It can get in and actually flip seed out of the trench. I like all the wheels that we run on these planters. We stagger the wheel, one in the front, one in the back. On the left side, I think it changes, but the left side, we've got rows 1 through 8 on the 16 row, one in the front, one in the back. When I get to row 9, switch it. So it kind of mirrors both sides. I do that. I like that versus running them parallel with each other where they pinch. I like one in the front and then the one in the back to overlap. And I think it does, at least in the heavier no-till clay soil here, it does a better job at getting that slot kind of zipper closed, I guess you could say. I think that's what they call it. It does a good job, but you have to be aware, like if you call in and talk to Dawn Equipment or Yetter or somebody else, they're probably not going to suggest doing that because you've got to be aware that tailpiece is adjustable. So I can get, you know, a brand new planer set up in the shop, all the closing wheels on there, and set them up staggered. Even if I run them parallel with a new planer, always adjust that tailpiece. I always see, I mean, even from the factory, brand new planers come, that tailpiece is not adjusted. The easiest way to do that, get the planer out in the field, unfolded, set it down, pull forward, you know, 5 feet, let the unit do its thing, and then get back there and look what your closing wheels look like. If your closing wheels are offset, you're going to have to loosen up that bolt. It's an eccentric bolt, so we can adjust it on both sides, loosen it up, and center the wheels. So a lot of times that tailpiece is going to look crooked, but when it's running, the wheels are centered over the slot right there. If you're running them parallel, even if you're going to run just the rubbers and everything I've said is worthless and you're going to stick with your rubbers, do that, but make sure your rubbers are centered on the slot. I mean, brand new planters right out of the box, straight from John Deere, from the, you know, the dealership to the field. I've seen those tailpieces cocked and that closing wheel, one's running directly on top of the slot and one is way off doing nothing. Make sure that's centered. If you're going to run your wheels like we run ours staggered, that slot, you can never get that tight enough where it's going to want to stay. Through the season, it's always going to want to adjust a little bit. So you've got to be aware of that. You know, you put 1,000 acres, a couple thousand acres, that tailpiece is probably adjusted and tried to align itself and straighten it out, and it might be putting one wheel directly over the trench there. So be conscious of that. Be looking at that as you go through there. If you want to run them parallel, do it. If you've got issues with rocks in your soils, running them offset versus parallel, you can cut down the risk of pinching a rock in there. We typically, with the curve tine, really hasn't been an issue. A straight spike wheel, maybe every now and then could catch a rock and pin up. The Schlagel, I know we've had issues with rocks, more issues with stalks on that Schlagel setup, just in our soil. But with any kind of straight spike wheel that's not giving you any firming, that's where, I'll briefly talk about the seed firmer. That's where Paul was a big fan of a seed firmer. That's critical. You have to have a seed firmer. If you don't have a wheel on there that's not giving you firming, if it's not a rubber, if it's not, you know, a gauge tine or anything with a thumbprint that's gonna, even the Furrow Cruiser is gonna firm around that slot. But if you're running a straight spike wheel, there's no firming going on. So if you don't get the seed to the bottom of that slot with a Keaton seed firmer or the other options that are out there, trying to get that to the bottom of the slot, like Zapta. The other options that are out there, get that firmer to the bottom, that seed to the bottom of the slot, so that spike wheel doesn't catch that seed and flip it out of the trench. And I've seen guys run the spike wheel and it's dead center and it's an aggressive. I've even seen guys run the big 15-inch. I really would be cautious on running a 15-inch closing wheel on the back of the tailpiece. They'll sometimes run a rubber tire in the 15-inch in the front of it. The rubber tire is keeping the 15-inch from getting too deep and getting into where the seed is. But the problem is, if it's centered, if the tailpiece is centered, that's great. The problem is when I go through a turn or something, if I've got that closing wheel right here and I go through a turn around a waterway or even just the slightest turn, it moves that closing wheel directly almost on top of where that seed was just placed. And if you do that, right there, that closing wheel is going to flip that seed right out of the trench. That's a bad day. So the 15-inch wheels, I really don't like getting to that, 13, 12 and a half inch, whatever they end up measuring at. I'm going to run less risk of, but make sure that slot, your closing wheels are centered directly over that slot. So the Keaton seed firmer, we've tried it on the planter here, we've done, side by side with it, have not seen a need for it on our setup here, where, as I said, the closing wheels we always have a firming built into it. So I'm always firming around there. If I'm not using a firming wheel, if I'm running like just a straight spike wheel that's not designed to firm but break up just compaction alone, I have to have a seed firmer built into that. Closing wheels, I think I could keep talking about all the different closing wheel options all day. So we'll move from there we'll look at fertilizer placement. This is a basic setup. Fertilizer placement on a planter, a lot of guys don't want to mess with it. It's a hassle, I agree, especially at planting time. It can be a real pain to get it on there. If you're no-till cover crops, especially with green cover crops, I think it's mandatory to have it on there. The corn planter is putting in furrow. We're doing it in furrow system, and we're also doing a system out the back. The video that we showed has the totally tubular that's dribbling directly on top. That's putting our nitrogen on. Right with that system, there's no incorporation. I'm not running a 2x2 system in that situation. This, before we go to the picture, and I move and make everybody dizzy again, this is a basic fertilizer system. This is an electric 12-volt pump, very simple. This is using a totally tubular. This would be a totally tubular, and Paul kind of talked about this a little bit too. This is the factory John Deere frog piece where the disc openers go on the outside of, and they just weld on a stainless tube, and it comes up, and you can pop right on there. And that gives you a really easy access to get in furrow on if you're not using the Keaton seed firmer. I do like putting the fertilizer on in furrow up front of the seed. So this is placed in the seed behind it versus the seed in the Keaton seed firmer. We used to have issues with the seed firmer wanting to build up with mud, that heavier clay soil. And Paul mentioned the same thing. If it's building up with mud, there's not enough tension. We played with the tension. We're constantly fighting getting the singulation that we wanted, and we thought maybe that Keaton seed firmer. So we pulled them off half. Like I said, always try on your farm. Everything I've said today, we pulled off half of the Keaton seed firmers on the 16-row planter and planted the whole season. Never saw a uniform, never saw an emergence issue from one side to the other. So we, the next year we even tried the short ones and the long ones together, and again, never saw anything on our farms. We have not used them for the last 5 or 6 years. I do like these systems. There's a company, Fastco, over in Illinois, uses just this little simple spark plug boot. I really like that. They run the 1/4 inch, just a quick connect 1/4 inch line into that and into that spark plug boot. And that spark plug boot is a good, cheap, easy way to get that on there and then keep that line from popping out. It just kind of keeps it connected. There's some quick connect pieces that we can put on there. But if we're going to do that, we've got to make sure that, we scuff up that, because that quick connect piece, it's a stainless tooth on there biting onto a stainless tooth. A lot of times you can still pop those right off. A simple red ball system to make sure that we're getting every row where we want it to go. The system on this planter, actually both planters we've been playing with the Express in-row fertilizer system, just the monitoring. There's a lot of different options when it comes to fertilizer. As I said, this is a basic 12-volt setup. Okay, can you show the picture for the no-till or for the 2x2 fertilizer placement? Okay, so this is a 2x2 fertilizer placement on an older Kinsey. This is a Dawn system that we put on there. All right, show the next one. All right, the next one. So it's a 2x2. It fits between the rows. This is actually it's a 15 and a 30 inch planter. This one was set up for a guy locally that's doing sweet corn and wants to put all of his nitrogen on with sweet corn and wants to get it deep. This actually has a hydraulic system, the same system, the down pressure system that I'm using on the row unit, I've got on my 2x2 system. So I'm making sure that I get equal depth row to row. It works really well. All right, show, I don't know if there's another one. Yeah, show the next one. Okay, so that's in the field, the row unit's down. All right, go back live. So with that 2x2 system set up on there, I like it. I like the placement, but there's a lot of disturbance to get to that. So 2x2, just so you know, everybody probably knows, 2x2 is 2 inches away from the center of the slot, 2 inches away from the seed, 2 inches below the seed, not 2 inches below soil surface. So if I'm planting 2 inches deep, that's 2 inches away, 4 inches down. Very rarely do we ever see an OEM factory 2x2 system get to a 4 inch depth. Very rarely do I ever see that. 3 inches maybe, but without having an active system that can actually push the system down to get that 4 inch depth, just can't get leverage off the planter. It also, if you notice, with a 2x2 system on there, we pulled it off of this planter. This planter's never had it. The planter before, actually we ordered it without it. And we were gonna run the Dawn CFX system that you saw there with that hydraulic setup, and ended up, we put on, I don't know if you can see, we put on the totally tubulars, which is a split, and it just bolts onto the tailpiece. This is a cheap, I think they're like 42, 45, or 50 bucks a row. Very cheap when you're looking at adding attachments to a planter. Very easy to get on, very easy to adjust. So I'm splitting, I'm dribbling on top. You are gonna run a higher risk of volatilization there. You're putting your nitrogen on top, right behind. It's a safe way to do it, but you're going to run a risk of volatilization. So ideally, I do like getting that fertilizer in underneath the soil surface, so I don't have to worry about that. But I just have not found a great way to do that yet. The factory 2x2 system, you know, you're limited. It's expensive to get it on there, and then you start talking about the drag on a planter, putting 16 rows on there, and then trying to get up to that 8 miles an hour with a high-speed planter, or even at 5 miles an hour. The amount of power it takes to get those in the ground and then pull it I was very surprised how much that actually took to do that. So a nice simple way. This setup, we've got the quick connect set up on here with the tubes. I run orifices on there. When we get into fertilizer placement, it's almost like closing wheels. There's always a new one coming out. You know, you can move the bracket, you can run the disc out here. There's a couple companies doing that. I've had issues with that. We have not run it on this planter. I've had concern with moving the tailpiece back. First off, transport's going to be a little wider, which we can do, but it also starts messing with my closing wheel because I've moved the closing wheels back now. So the way the closing wheels are working, I'm not getting as much leverage as I was before. I'm also, when I turn, you know, these are back here further. And the guys that have had issues with closing wheels have always had something where it's moved the tailpiece back and they've stuck, you know, notched discs right there, or it builds up with mud. I haven't found a great system that I really like. In Furrow, you know, with the ExactEmerge, I'm just running a John Deere factory. I'm actually putting it on behind the seed because this is a brush drive, and I want to worry about putting the fertilizer up front and getting build up in the brush. So I'm running a John Deere factory, just a little plastic bracket. It's putting on right in the middle of the slot, behind the seed, right on top of the seeds for my in-furrow. The 2x2 is putting on out the back. Like I said, these are both, as far as placement-wise, the cheapest option I think that you can put on here, but it works well. I like it. We've taken into account the amount of volatilization, so we've actually switched products from a 28 sulfate to another nitrogen source. We use like an agri-liquid product that is lower volatilizing, and it seems to work a little better, but that's something to be conscious of if you're putting it right on top of the row like that. And then as far as pumps go, this one's set up with, I've just built my own system with a high pro. I've got 2 high pro centrifugal pumps, 2 different PWMs, ran it through a John Deere Ray controller, and you can spend as much money as you want. You can spend as little. You can run, you know, a basic system like the Kinsey planter that we showed runs a fertilized system with a ground driven pump. Very basic. As you speed up, it's going to increase. So that's that with that. I'm going to go make everybody dizzy again, and we're going to look at the bean planter very quickly. All right, so this is our 15-inch bean planter set up here. This has the narrow, I believe these are Needham's wheels set up on there. So it's a 15-inch row spacing versus the 30. I think it's critical. I really like these on there. These have the PTT blades as well. It has so on a 15-inch row, I'm running a single trash wheel with a bracket that pushes the trash wheel up front. I like it. It moves just enough residue away from the disc openers so that it's not plugging. It's not trying to build up between the rows. If I run dual trash wheels on a 15-inch setup, I'm going to start windrowing. I'm going to get a great stand of 30-inch beans, and in between those rows, I'm going to have 15-inch beans that are struggling to pop through because I just threw all that residue on there. So I've got a trash wheel, that single 12 3/4-inch trash wheel directly in front of the disc opener. It's not helping my ride quality on the row unit. It's not helping my ride quality on the gauge wheels, but it's just clearing that residue out in front of the disc openers. This planter, actually, we popped off all of the trash wheels, and for the last 2 years, because it's going into cereal rye, my apologies, I'm going to be doing some more moving. With that cereal rye on the bean planter, we actually took the trash wheels off and are just running disc openers. No Coulters or anything. Going into a stand of 6-foot tall cereal rye, it's going to wrap pretty much no matter what it is, even with them sucked all the way up. So just popping the bolt off and taking those off has worked really well. So now, do we have time to do the Plan B options?
We are at 9:30, so if anybody has a 9:30 meeting, you're a couple minutes late already. But yes, if you're willing to hang on with us, AJ, we've got some more time. Okay.
Yeah, if there are any more questions, I'll go ahead and show the Plan B, the first picture. This is something that I've been working with the last 6-7 years, guys that are wanting to transition to no-till, that are still kind of more of that conventional till. The planters are set up. Strip till has been a really good bridge. Basically, it's kind of a marriage, the idea of no till and conventional till. I'm just stripping just an 8-inch, wide, 4 or 5 inch deep strip. The planter, when all these planter modifications that I've talked about that you really need to look at doing, looking at strip till, pretty much any planter can plant into a strip like that. Show the next one. I like stripping into and kind of marrying the idea of strip till and cover crops. So that's going into a stand of alfalfa, stripped into it. That planter can follow it that same day and plant right into that, then come down and do your burn down after that. Is just made, as for a guy that's got started with trying to get a planter to work in no-till and cover crop, strip till has been a huge improvement in some operations. I'm not saying everybody needs it, but it's something to think about. A planter, it just makes planter modification so much easier, and pretty much anything, like I said, can plant into that. So that's strip till, and just trying to marry that idea of no-till and conventional, and not getting really aggressive with it, a high-speed, low horsepower machine. All right, show the next one. All right, this is always a cool picture. This is a white planter with the Dawn ZRX roller crimpers on the front of it, with a Massey with some big wide LSW tires, and it's always a cool picture. Show the next one. This is that planter, the actual setup of that same planter, showing the ZRX roller crimper. All right, the next one. So the ZRX roller crimper is designed when you're going to be planting into cereal rye, mature cereal rye that's 5-6 feet tall that you can roll and snap at the stem. The idea here is that we can plant and roll and crimp all at the same time without making a pass of a roller crimper, then planting on top of that and trying to get to the bottom of that, the trench. We've got the trash wheel design built, kind of incorporated into the ZRX itself, so that it's pulling the rye away from the actual slot, and it's just the disc openers are planting right into it. I really like this setup if it works well in your area, and that's always the thing with cover crops. This is why this one's called a plan B. This is probably a plan C, plan D, and it just keeps going down. Cover crops, there's always, as soon as you figure out what you're going to do the next year, it's going to be completely different and it's going to change. I like this setup, when it works, when the rye is mature enough, but a lot of times that gets into, May, 1st of June before the rye is mature enough that we can roll it, crimp it, and terminate it. If that setup would work well for you in your area, I think it's great. Run the planter and roll and crimp all at the same time. It works well if the rye is mature enough. If it doesn't, that's where we have different options, running a roller separate and then coming in with the planter and planting on top of that. That's a situation where we probably use like a disc opener, narrow, as I said, a rippled disc opener, set high, and then the disc opener is behind it. So, all right, I think, is that the last one?
Yep, that is your last slide.
Okay.
There's a question here for you too, AJ.
Yeah.
What are those tubes coming around that white planter? And then it says dry fertilizer.
Oh, that setup, that's actually the seed tubes. So it's a drop style. They're actually dropping the seed down into the meter. So that's the white style. That's a dry. They're actually, this system, I believe, they're running the same, that TT300, the totally tubular that I'm running on the planter here, and they're just dribbling. So it's they're using a liquid and they're dribbling right on top of the row behind it. And that's one of the things with the ZRX setup like that. When it's on the planter, we can't do a 2x2 system. So, and I do still think there needs to be fertilizer on the planter. So really your only options are to do an in-furrow product or do some kind of product out the back on top. Setup like, the totally tubular seems to work really well, and I like that. But getting some nitrogen on with that rye is critical. So, all right, we can go back live. That is all I had today. So I'm sure I missed lots, and I'll remember later. But I don't know if there's any other questions.
We don't have any more currently, but of course, if anybody has any last burning questions, feel free to drop them into the chat or the Q&A. I guess quickly we should refer back. AJ, you mentioned Paul quite a bit. That is Paul Yassa from UNL Extension, who has done planter setups and things for a long time, research trials and such. We did a webinar with him a couple of weeks ago, and we did one with Phil Needham, who also got mentioned, oh gosh, maybe a month ago now. I don't know, quite some time. But those videos are or will be up on our YouTube channel that can be found from our website, ccsin.org. And we do have another question that came into the chat while I've been talking here. Says, I may have missed what you said about gauge wheels. Do you prefer the narrow wheels behind a row cleaner?
Yes. Typically, I'm going to always prefer a narrow gauge wheel, something narrower than the 4.5 inch. The only time I don't like the narrow wheel is if I'm in a real light conventional till soil. Then we maybe use that 4.5 inch, the factory, the OEM one, on that setup. But if we're in no-till, strip till, because that strip, I want to stay on the strip. But if we're in a conventional till, then we'll stay with the factory wide. The rest of the time, I like the narrower gauge wheels. I kind of like the 3-spoke idea. Like I said, we don't plant mud, but you guys might. So, but yeah, that setup I like. I think it's a good setup, and it's something I would advise. Yeah.